"You're only here because I felt sorry for you," my mom said while passing my brother a set of flight tickets. She didn't even glance at me when she said it. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. The way someone might say the soup's too salty or the laundry's done. The tickets were thick, glossy, unmistakably first class, and I recognized them the second she slid them across the marble counter. I had booked them, with my own bonus. I stood still, one hand resting on the back of the kitchen chair, the other curled loosely around the stem of a half-empty wine glass. My brother Lucas gave a short laugh, more out of surprise than joy, then muttered something about how nice this was. No one addressed the cost. No one addressed me. If you're wondering why I didn't say anything right then, the truth is, I'd been taught my whole life to stay quiet in moments like that, to pretend the slight was unintentional, that the dig wasn't meant to wound, that I was being sensitive. But that night, I wasn't shocked. I was done. My name is Brittany Borowski. I'm 32 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I work as a senior strategy consultant for a global media firm. On paper, I have a lot to be proud of. I'm good at what I do. I lead multi-million-dollar campaigns. Clients fly in to hear me speak, but at that dinner, none of it mattered. Not to the people sitting across from me, not to my mother, who once told me that real success meant knowing when to make room for others, like my brother, not to my father, who poured another glass of bourbon and said nothing at all, and definitely not to Lucas, whose entire adult life had been one long series of half-starts and safety nets I helped stitch together. I grew up in a 2-story brick house in the northwest suburbs, the kind of place with flower beds out front and a wreath on the door year-round. My mother, Madeline, used to teach elementary school before she decided to focus on family when Lucas was born. My father, Gregory, was a quiet man, more comfortable fixing gutters than fixing conflict. And Lucas. Well, Lucas was the star. He always had been. At the age of 9, he broke a neighbor's window playing baseball and cried so hard my mom baked cookies for the neighbor to apologize. When I tripped on a sidewalk and skinned my knees, I was scolded for not watching where I was going. In high school, Lucas failed algebra 3 times. I helped him study for each retake. When I graduated with honors and won a national debate title, the family dinner that night was cut short so Lucas could watch a game with his friends. Patterns were set early, expectations even earlier. And yet, like many oldest daughters in toxic family dynamics, I kept trying. I bought my parents a new washer-dryer combo when theirs gave out. I paid off Lucas's rent one month when he forgot his account was overdrawn. And 3 weeks ago, when he mentioned a work opportunity in Tokyo, I quietly booked first-class tickets for my family. I told myself it was a gesture of goodwill, a way to show them I still cared. Maybe if they saw how far I'd come, they'd finally see me for who I was. But that night, standing in my childhood kitchen with my name erased from the narrative, I saw things clearly. The tickets weren't a thank you. They were proof. Proof that no matter what I gave, it would never be enough. My mother didn't even lie about the tickets being hers. She didn't need to. Her message was louder than anything she could have written in ink. I left dinner before dessert. I said I had an early meeting, which wasn't true, but no one challenged it. I grabbed my purse, nodded toward my dad, and walked out as my mother handed Lucas a printed itinerary. She didn't even notice me go. Back in my apartment that night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my shoes still on and asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What exactly was I still trying to prove, and to whom? Because the truth is, I didn't want their approval anymore. I wanted my peace. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time to take it back. It wasn't the first time my contributions had been rewritten or ignored, but that night it felt final. There was a clarity in my silence I hadn't felt before. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just a quiet ending to a story I had stayed in far too long. I didn't cry when I got home. I didn't throw anything or call Lena to vent. Instead, I poured a glass of water, sat on my couch, and let my thoughts unfold like a spreadsheet I'd left untouched for years. Each row was a memory. Each column was a version of me trying to be what they wanted, and each total came out the same, insufficient. When I was 14, I built my first website from scratch. It was for my school's community fundraiser, and it helped raise more money than the previous 5 years combined. I remember showing it to my parents, proud and excited, hoping for a reaction. My mother had barely looked up from folding laundry when she said, "That's nice. But don't you think you're spending too much time on the computer? You're not going to become one of those tech nerds, are you?" I still remember the heat rushing to my face, the way my fingers curled into my palms. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that the work should be enough, that someone, somewhere, would notice. Years later, when I was accepted into Stanford's media strategy program with a partial scholarship, my father said it was great but a little far. My mother asked if I was sure I wasn't rushing things, if maybe a smaller school closer to home would be wiser. Lucas, meanwhile, had just dropped out of his second semester at a local state college. They gave him a used car to help him get back on track. I remember loading my own suitcases into a rideshare at 5 a.m. on my way to the airport. Neither of my parents came out to wave goodbye. I didn't expect them to. I graduated top of my class and got hired straight into a consulting firm that usually preferred people with 3 years of experience. Within 5 years, I was leading projects across 3 continents, but at Thanksgiving, the conversation was always about Lucas's newest business idea, his latest job trial, or his growth. When I brought up a campaign I had just run for a major brand that made headlines, my mom smiled tightly and said, "That's nice. Dear, but we were just talking about Lucas's move to Denver. That's how it always was." My wins were footnotes. His were headlines. Even so, I kept showing up. I kept buying birthday cakes, sending flowers on anniversaries, covering gaps in rent when Lucas forgot his account was linked to an old card. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because that's what I was trained to do. Be the reliable one. The one who fixed things quietly and never asked for thanks. I had turned my silence into a survival skill, but it came at a cost. Sitting in my apartment that night, I started calculating the financial help I had given over the years. I opened my laptop, mostly out of habit, and began pulling up old bank records, rent transfers, medical copays. That time their basement flooded and I paid for emergency plumbing and mold remediation without blinking. I added them up, just out of curiosity. The number shocked me. Over $94,000 in 7 years. That didn't even include the Tokyo trip or the monthly auto deposit I had set up 2 years ago to help them with household emergencies. I never asked what those emergencies were. I just kept sending. What disturbed me wasn't the number. It was the fact that no one had ever thanked me. Not once. Not even a text. It was always expected, absorbed, then forgotten. The emotional math was even worse. I realized I had been operating like a shadow in my own life. Always present but never acknowledged. Always giving but never seen. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. My apartment was quiet. Every item in its place. Minimalist, clean, but impersonal. It had always felt like a hotel room I hadn't checked out of yet. For the first time. I asked myself why, and the answer was simple. I had never built anything for myself that I didn't hope they would eventually admire. The art on the walls, the sleek furniture, the view. It had all been selected with some vague, desperate hope that one day my parents would visit and say, "We're proud of you." They never did. They never would. And I was done waiting. The morning after that dinner, I called in sick for the first time in over a year. I wasn't physically ill, but something inside had collapsed in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I made coffee the way I always did, dark roast, 1 sugar, almond milk, but I couldn't taste it. The apartment felt even quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. I walked past my glass desk, where a list of upcoming presentations waited for my attention, and instead sat down with a yellow legal pad and wrote 1 sentence across the top in block letters. What do I actually want? I stared at the question for a long time. Not what would make them proud. Not what sounded impressive at a reunion. Just, what did I want? And for the first time in years, I didn't have an answer. Around noon, I finally called Lena. She picked up on the first ring, her voice cheerful and alert like always. "You didn't show up to the leadership call." Everything okay? I told her I needed a personal day. She didn't ask why. She never did. Lena had a way of sensing when to lean in and when to give space, but something in my voice must have tipped her off, because she paused and said, "Do you want to talk about it?" I hesitated, then said quietly, "They gave him the tickets. My tickets. And my mother told me she only kept me around because she felt sorry for me." There was a long silence. Then Lena said, "Brittany, that's not just cruel. That's abuse." The word landed heavily. Abuse. I had never labeled it that way before. I always thought of abuse as something loud and visible, something people had scars from. But what Lena was describing was quieter, more invisible, and maybe more dangerous, because you learned to question whether it was even real. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking along the river, earbuds in but no music playing. Just silence, and the sound of my boots hitting pavement, one step at a time. I thought about how many times I had covered for them, defended them, made excuses. I thought about all the little betrayals that had been dressed up as traditions or jokes. And then I thought about the Tokyo trip, the one I had planned so carefully. I remembered researching flights that would give my mother extra legroom, because she always complained about how cramped coach was. I remembered picking the hotel based on proximity to temples I knew my dad would love. I remembered transferring airline miles into Lucas's account so he could get lounge access. I had done all of that without a second thought. And now, sitting on a cold bench beside the river, I realized it had never been about the gift. It had been about being seen, being acknowledged, and instead, I had been erased. That night, I opened my laptop again, not for bank records, not for work. This time, I logged into my airline portal and canceled all 3 tickets. I took the cancellation fee without flinching. Then I emailed the hotel to request a refund. Fortunately, I had booked a flexible package when prompted for the cancellation reason. I typed, "Change in personal circumstances." It felt vague and clean. I went through the tour reservations, the dinner bookings, the spa sessions, one by one. I dismantled the entire itinerary. It took less than an hour to undo what had taken weeks to build. But with each click, I felt a little more steady, like I was claiming space I didn't know I had lost. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't announce it. There was no dramatic confrontation or vindictive text, just a quiet retraction, a removal of myself from the equation. The next morning, I called my bank and paused the monthly auto deposit into my parents' emergency fund. I didn't close the account, not yet. I just stopped feeding it, like cutting off water to a leaking pipe. It wasn't revenge, it was relief. Later that week, I booked an appointment with a therapist I had been meaning to call for over a year. His name was Dr. Fields, middle-aged, thoughtful eyes, the kind of man who looked like he'd seen a lot without needing to talk about it. In our first session, he asked why I had come in. I told him the truth, because I realized I've been trying to buy love with airline tickets and silent suffering, and it's not working. He didn't flinch. He nodded once and said, "Then let's start by figuring out where that belief began." Something told me it was going to be a long journey, but for once, I didn't feel scared of it. I felt ready. Therapy didn't change things overnight, but it gave me language for things I had only ever felt. Dr. Fields called it covert emotional neglect, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but teaches you, quietly and consistently, that your needs don't matter unless they benefit someone else. That phrase stayed with me. It explained why I had spent years measuring my value through usefulness, why silence felt safer than confrontation, why I would rather overfunction in every relationship than risk being viewed as difficult. I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, not just in my family, but in my friendships, my work, even in the way I decorated my apartment. Everything had been curated for someone else's comfort. Even my own success had been shaped around the idea of becoming undeniable, so successful they couldn't overlook me, so essential they had to care. But they never did, because that kind of love can't be earned through achievement. It has to be offered freely. And mine never was. About 2 weeks after the dinner, I got a text from my mom, It was short. Are you still planning to send us the hotel info? No apology, no mention of the canceled tickets. Just an assumption that I'd resume my role. I didn't reply. An hour later came another message. Lucas said your card was declined when he tried to check the flight status. Is there a problem? That one made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so on brand. Lucas had apparently still tried to access the trip, assuming I'd put his name on everything. I hadn't. I had learned that lesson after the time he used my name to lease a car and defaulted on payments. When I brought it up back then, my mother said, "You're the responsible one. You'll fix it." And I did. But this time, I was done fixing what I didn't break. Instead of replying, I opened a new document and began drafting a summary of every financial contribution I had made to my family over the last 10 years, not out of spite, but for clarity. Mortgage help, medical bills, bailouts, gifts, loans that were never repaid. When I finished, the number sat at $131,400. I stared at the figure and felt nothing. No pride, no resentment. Just a quiet recognition that I had been playing a role I never auditioned for, and it was time to step off the stage. At work, people began to notice a shift in me. I wasn't working longer hours or saying yes to everything. I had started saying no and not explaining it. That was new. Lena pulled me aside after a team presentation and said, "You're sharper lately, like something clicked." I just nodded. I didn't know how to tell her that what had clicked wasn't ambition. It was self-respect. One evening, while organizing digital files, I stumbled across an old shared folder with my mom labeled "Documents to Save." Curious. I opened it. Most of it was scanned bills and forms I'd filled out for her tax documents, insurance claims, outdated W-2s from Lucas's temp jobs. But one file caught my eye. It was a scanned application to a home equity loan I didn't recognize. I clicked it open, and that's when my stomach dropped. My name was listed as a co-signer, without my consent. The loan had been issued 2 years ago. I recognized the address and the details. It was when they remodeled their kitchen. My mother had called me that spring asking questions about rates and vendors, but never mentioned taking out a loan, certainly not one tied to my credit. The signature was mine, but I had never signed that document. It had been copied from another form. I sat there for a long time, eyes fixed on the screen, pulse steady but cold. This wasn't neglect. This was fraud. I didn't scream. I didn't call her in a rage. I just printed the document, slid it into a folder, and booked an appointment with a financial advisor and later a lawyer. The process was quiet but firm. I had the digital trail to prove forgery. The consequences would come later. For now, I had what I needed most control. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was acting, not out of anger, but out of self-protection. Not to hurt anyone, but to protect myself from being hurt again. I wasn't trying to teach them a lesson or earn their remorse. I was building a boundary strong enough to keep me safe, even if no one apologized, even if nothing changed. That was the real shift. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I was looking for peace. I didn't expect the consequences of my silence to come so quickly. 3 days after I consulted the lawyer, my mother left a voicemail that started with feigned confusion and ended in thinly veiled panic. "Hi, Brittany. Not sure what's going on, but there's been a weird hold on the equity line. Can you look into it? We've got a kitchen contractor waiting on a final payment." There was no mention of the forged signature, no apology, no ownership, just a request disguised as an obligation, like she was doing me a favor by asking nicely instead of blaming outright. I didn't return the call. Instead, I met with Lena for lunch at a small cafe we used to frequent when we were both interns. I hadn't planned on sharing everything, but when she asked how things were going, I found myself telling her about the forged documents and the lawyer and how calm I had felt through all of it. She leaned back slowly and looked at me with a kind of awe I wasn't used to. "You're really doing it," she said. "You're stepping out of the loop." I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. The loop was the cycle of proving and appeasing, of giving in hopes of being valued. And finally, I had stopped running in circles. Work became more than a distraction. It became a space I could finally take up without guilt. I started speaking more in meetings, pitching ideas without softening them first, owning my wins instead of downplaying them. My director noticed. A month later, she pulled me into a one-on-one and offered me a temporary leadership position on a global rollout project based in Singapore. It was an opportunity I would have said no to in the past, not because I didn't want it, but because my mother would have found a way to guilt me out of leaving. She'd call it selfish. She'd say, "What if something happens while you're gone? Or worse, who's going to help Lucas if he gets overwhelmed again?" But this time, I didn't ask for anyone's permission. I said yes on the spot. After I accepted the offer, I gave myself one full weekend to prepare, not just professionally, but emotionally. I turned off my phone, took long walks, and started building a list of things I wanted to leave behind, not just physical things, but habits, mindsets, stories that no longer served me. I wrote down everything I had been told that I was too intense, too ambitious, too independent, and then I wrote what I actually was: strategic, resilient, self-directed. I saw the contrast clearly now. The problem was never who I had been. It was that they couldn't handle a version of me that didn't need their permission to exist. On Monday, I called my father, not because I expected support, but because part of me still hoped he might quietly understand. He picked up after 2 rings. I told him I'd be relocating for at least 6 months, possibly longer. There was a long pause, followed by the familiar sigh I had grown up with, the kind that always meant discomfort wrapped in avoidance. "Well," he said, "I suppose you're doing what you think is best. Your mother's not going to take it well." I waited, but he didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask why, just a quiet disappointment that I'd dared to remove myself from the script. I thanked him for taking the call and hung up before he could add anything else. Packing felt strangely symbolic. I didn't bring much, just essentials and a few personal items that reminded me of who I was when no one else was watching. A framed photo Lena had taken of me laughing mid-sentence. A folded piece of paper with a quote from Dr. Fields, "You don't owe anyone access to the parts of you they've consistently harmed." And a postcard I had bought years ago but never mailed. It said, "Someday you'll understand why I left." I didn't know who I had intended to send it to back then. Now I did, and I wasn't going to send it. I was going to live it. The night before my flight, Lucas texted, "Mom says you're leaving. Just wanted to say good luck. Let me know if you want help moving." No apology, no acknowledgement of anything deeper. Just a sentence that felt half curious, half performative. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry. I just didn't have anything left to explain. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like choice. Singapore was humid in a way Portland never prepared me for. The air felt thick even before sunrise, and the city never truly quieted down, not even at night. But something about the constant movement, the glass towers, the clean sidewalks, the sharp rhythms of a place that demanded precision, it fit me. It felt like a version of myself I had kept on hold was finally being called to the stage. The team was diverse, competitive, and refreshingly uninterested in personal drama. No one cared about your family or your origin story unless it made the strategy better. That suited me just fine. I was placed in charge of market entry for a tech client preparing to launch a digital ecosystem across Southeast Asia. The stakes were high, and the timelines unforgiving, but I loved the clarity of it. Numbers didn't lie. Either the campaign converted or it didn't. There was no room for favoritism, no space for vague compliments or passive-aggressive jabs. Every win was earned, every loss had a name, and most importantly, I was treated as an equal, not an accessory to someone else's ego. Lena checked in via video once a week. She said my face looked lighter, and I realized she was right. Even though I was working longer hours, I wasn't exhausted. There was a difference between being tired and being drained, and for the first time in a long time, I was just tired. Not emotionally depleted, not constantly calculating how to preempt someone else's disappointment, just tired, in a clean way, from doing work that mattered. My evenings were quiet. I picked up running again. circling Marina Bay while the skyline lit up behind me. I read novels I had ignored for years. I started journaling not in a reflective, poetic way, but in bullet point lists of what I had survived and what I was no longer willing to tolerate. Some nights, I just stared out my apartment window and let myself feel the stillness. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I didn't have to answer questions I didn't want to. And that, in itself, was more healing than anything therapy had given me. About 6 weeks into the project, I met Daniel. He worked with our partner agency in Kuala Lumpur, a financial analyst with a dry sense of humor and an uncanny ability to stay calm in high-pressure meetings. At first, our conversations were all business, then became more relaxed, then slowly personal. He didn't pry, didn't ask about my background beyond what I offered. He told me his story in pieces: divorced parents, long-distance siblings, the pressure of being the only child who kept things functional. I recognized parts of myself in his language. He had learned how to become invisible too, but unlike me, he had stopped apologizing for being visible again. One night, after a long dinner and too much wine, he said something that stuck with me. You carry your strength like a shield, but sometimes strength can be something softer, something that bends but doesn't break. I didn't respond right away, because I wasn't used to kindness that didn't have strings attached. But I remembered his words later. When my phone lit up with a call from an unknown Portland number, I let it go to voicemail. The next morning, I listened to it over coffee. It was my father's voice, measured, tired. Hi. Brittany, your mother's upset. She says she hasn't heard from you in weeks. I think she's just struggling with how things played out. I know it's not my place to ask, but maybe you could give her a call, just to check in. She's not doing well. You know how she gets. Anyway, I hope you're okay. He didn't say he missed me. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the loan, or the tickets, or the years of imbalance. Just a soft request, wrapped in guilt, disguised as concern. I didn't return that call either, because by then, I had learned that absence is sometimes a form of self-respect, that not responding is still a form of response. That silence, when chosen intentionally, speaks louder than any forced reconciliation, and I wasn't angry anymore. I just knew I wasn't going back. The message from my father lingered for a few days in the back of my mind, not because I considered responding, but because it confirmed something I had always known deep down. When things became uncomfortable, he defaulted to silence, then eventually to asking me to make peace so the discomfort would go away. He never questioned the root of it. He never challenged my mother's words or actions. His priority wasn't fairness. It was peace, even if that peace came at my expense. Knowing that didn't hurt like it used to. It just made things clearer. I no longer expected anything else from him. And strangely, that freed me. My life in Singapore grew fuller with each passing week. Daniel and I continued seeing each other, not in a whirlwind or fantasy way, but gradually, thoughtfully, like two people who had both learned the cost of proximity and wanted to move forward carefully. He never pushed for answers, never tried to play savior. He simply showed up, consistently and without performance, which for me was new. One night, after walking along the waterfront and sharing stories from childhood, he asked what I wanted next. Not from him, not from the job, but from myself. I didn't answer right away. Then I told him, I want a life that's not defined by who I had to survive. He nodded and didn't say a word, which I appreciated more than any long speech. Back at work, my regional rollout was ahead of schedule. My manager praised my leadership style in front of the entire executive team. She called it precise and quietly authoritative. I smiled, not because I needed the recognition, but because I had finally become the kind of person I used to pretend to be. I wasn't managing impressions anymore. I was simply leading, and people followed not because I demanded it, but because I had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Then one morning, about 10 weeks into my time abroad, I received an email flagged urgent. The subject line was short, Marcus. The sender was my uncle, my mother's younger brother, a man I barely spoke to but who had occasionally reached out on birthdays with short, Polite messages. I opened the email slowly, bracing for the worst. Inside, he explained that Marcus had been hospitalized after collapsing from what they suspected was a panic-induced cardiac episode. He was recovering, but fragile. My mother, he said, was overwhelmed and had been asking about you. There was no ask, no demand, no guilt, just information. I sat with it quietly, not out of fear or grief, but out of a careful curiosity about how I wanted to respond. Marcus and I hadn't spoken in months. His last message had been a vague half-apology and a weak attempt to re-engage after the fallout. I hadn't replied, not because I hated him, but because he had always benefited from my silence. If he had grown, he would show me in action, not through filtered updates sent by someone else. Still, something tugged at me, not obligation, but memory. I remembered being 12 and sneaking Pop-Tarts into his backpack because he hated school lunches. I remembered helping him study for his SATs even though I was already in college, working 2 jobs. I remembered laughing with him once in the driveway while washing the car, long before our parents built a wall between us made of expectation and favoritism. Those memories weren't enough to erase everything else, but they reminded me that the story was never one-dimensional. So I did something small. I responded to my uncle's email with a single sentence. Thanks for the update. I hope he recovers well. No warmth, no false bridge building, but no cruelty either. Just truth, and it felt right. That same night, while standing in my apartment with the city glowing below, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to write long letters or host confrontations or seek apologies that would never arrive in the form I needed. My boundaries weren't lines I drew in sand. They were now walls made of calm decisions and quiet consistency. People could knock, but I would decide who got to enter, and on what terms. The next morning, I resumed work as usual. The world hadn't shifted, but I had, and that, I knew, was enough. 3 months after the rollout ended, I was offered a permanent leadership role based in Singapore, with an expanded scope that included oversight of regional strategy for all of Asia-Pacific. I didn't celebrate the way I used to. There was no impulsive champagne toast, no frantic texts to people hoping they'd feel proud of me. I sat on the edge of my neatly made bed, staring at the email, and just breathed, not out of shock, but recognition. This wasn't luck. It wasn't sudden. It was the natural result of showing up, day after day, without shrinking. I said yes to the role without hesitation. That weekend, Daniel and I took a short trip to Kyoto. He had always wanted to see the temples in person, and I craved a break from the fast pace of city life, walking among stone lanterns and moss-covered paths. I realized something I hadn't been able to articulate before. I was no longer waiting for life to slow down so I could feel at home in it. I had become someone who built home wherever she stood, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in my own story. One evening, while drinking tea in a quiet courtyard, Daniel asked gently if I ever missed them. He didn't specify who. He didn't need to. I took a long moment before answering. Sometimes, I said, but I don't miss the version of them that exists. I miss who I thought they could become. He didn't say anything after that. He just reached across the table and held my hand, and the silence was the kind that said everything it needed to. Back in Singapore, I fell into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Mornings began early, not with dread, but clarity. I found joy in structure, comfort in decision-making, and freedom in knowing I didn't have to keep choosing people who never chose me back. I still went to therapy, though less frequently. Dr. Fields said I had entered a new stage of healing, less about survival and more about creation. He asked me one afternoon, if your family never changes, never apologizes, never even contacts you again, can you still find peace? I said yes, not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared more about myself. A few weeks later, a message arrived in my work inbox from the company's West Coast office. A younger analyst named Natalie, whom I had mentored briefly years ago, had nominated me for a global leadership spotlight. She wrote, Brittany taught me that being clear is kinder than being agreeable, and that strong doesn't have to mean hard. I reread the line several times, surprised by how deeply it moved me. I hadn't realized anyone had been watching closely. Maybe that was the difference now. I had stopped performing, and people started noticing the real me. Then, unexpectedly, I received a message through my personal email. It was from Marcus. The subject line read simply, "I know it's been a while." I opened it cautiously. The message was short but different. Not defensive, not vague, just direct. "I've been in therapy. I know I was part of the problem. I know I used you and watched others do the same. I can't ask for a relationship. But if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. No expectations." I didn't know what to feel. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand gesture. But it was honest. And it was the first time he hadn't made himself the center of the story. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't even sure if I would. But I didn't delete the message either. I kept it, like a small stone you find on a beach that you don't know what to do with yet, but you hold on to it anyway. Because something about it feels different. I told Dr. Fields about it, and he asked only one question. "Do you believe him?" I didn't answer. Instead, I said, "I don't think that matters yet. What matters is I didn't feel pulled back into anything. I just felt still." That night, I walked along the river alone. The city lights reflected off the water like threads of gold. I thought about how far I had come, not just in geography, but in belief. I no longer believed that healing required other people to change. I no longer believed that I needed to keep chasing what had always been withheld. And I no longer believed that love meant tolerating harm. What I believed in now was choice, and for the first time in my life, I was making mine with both feet on the ground. Nearly a year after I left Portland, I returned not for them, but for myself. The company was hosting a regional summit in San Francisco, and since I was already on the West Coast, I decided to take a few days off and visit old friends, walk streets that once felt like a cage, and prove to myself that I could be back in the same time zone as my family without losing the center I had worked so hard to build. Daniel had flown in to meet me after his business trip in Chicago, and we rented a small house near the coast for a quiet weekend. No pressure, no schedule, just space. On the third morning, I woke up to a message from my father. It was short. "As usual, your mother would like to talk. No pressure. Just thought you should know she's been in therapy too. Let me know if you're willing." The phrasing was careful, almost transactional, like he was presenting it as an option, not a plea. I stared at the screen for a long time, not feeling much of anything, not fear, not anger, just a faint curiosity mixed with years of protective distance. I told Daniel about it while we walked the cliffs near Half Moon Bay. He didn't offer advice. He just asked, "What version of yourself would need to show up if you said yes?" That question sat with me longer than the message itself. Because the truth was, I didn't want to go back to being the daughter who swallowed herself whole to make other people feel comfortable. But I also knew I wasn't that girl anymore. If I showed up now, it would be as me whole, steady, unshakable. So I sent one reply, "I'll be in Portland for one night. I'm free at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Public place. Just us. If she's serious, she'll come." There was no response for hours. Then finally, "We'll be there." I corrected the second word in my head. She will be there. That was the point. I chose a quiet cafe near the park where she used to take me as a child, mostly because I liked the symmetry. I arrived 5 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I didn't want to rush. I ordered a tea, took the corner table, and waited. At exactly 5:02 p.m., she walked in. I barely recognized her at first. Her hair was shorter. Her face looked older, not just from time, but from effort. Real effort. She saw me and paused like she wasn't sure if I'd stay seated. I didn't move. She walked over slowly and sat down across from me without saying anything. The first thing I noticed was that she didn't launch into apologies or justifications. She just looked at me for a while and then said, "I wasn't ready to see what I had done to you. Now I can't unsee it." I waited, unsure what would come next. "I blamed you for being strong, because I wasn't." She added, And I celebrated your brother's weakness because it made me feel needed. That wasn't love. That was control. I didn't cry. I didn't nod. I just breathed, steady and full. Then I said, I'm not here to hear the right words. I'm here to see who you've become. She didn't flinch. I don't expect a relationship. She said, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to look you in the eye and say, I see it now, and I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional in the way I used to wish for. But it was honest. It was real. And maybe for the first time. It wasn't about getting me back. It was about letting me be. I stood up before she did. Thank you, I said simply. Then left without hugging her, without making plans, without promising anything, not out of cruelty, but because I needed the power to walk away and not explain why. Back at the rental, Daniel was waiting on the porch, a quiet look on his face like he already knew how it had gone. I didn't say much. I just sat beside him, leaned into the stillness, and said, It didn't change anything, but I think it changed something in me. He nodded and said, That's all healing ever really does. 6 months after that meeting at the cafe, I was standing backstage at an international leadership summit in Copenhagen, waiting to deliver the closing keynote. My name was printed on the screen behind me, along with a phrase the organizers had chosen from my interview, when you stop trying to earn worth. You start leading from it. I didn't remember saying that, but it felt true. The room was filled with people from dozens of countries, most of whom didn't know anything about my past. And yet, I felt more seen than I ever had around my own family. As I stepped on stage, I didn't think about my mother. I didn't think about Marcus or that voicemail from my father or the house I grew up in. I thought about the version of myself who once cried quietly in stairwells and smiled through meetings where her ideas were ignored. I thought about the girl who packed her entire life into 2 suitcases and left without telling anyone because she couldn't afford to wait for permission anymore, and I thought about how proud I was not of what I had accomplished, but of who I had become when no one was clapping. After the talk, I flew back to Singapore, where I had started setting down roots in ways that mattered, not just work, but life. I had joined a running group. I started volunteering with a mentoring program for first-generation college students. Daniel and I had moved into a quiet apartment with plants I somehow kept alive. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. It felt mine. One evening, while sorting through old files on a drive I hadn't touched in years, I found a voice memo I'd recorded during one of my last therapy sessions in Portland. I had titled it, For Future Me, Curious. I hit play. My voice sounded raw, almost unfamiliar. If you're listening to this, I said, I hope you've stopped explaining yourself to people who made you small. I hope you chose freedom, even if it meant being misunderstood. And I hope, more than anything, that you're not looking back. I didn't cry. I smiled, because I wasn't looking back, not in longing, not in regret, just in recognition. I hadn't spoken to Marcus again, and I hadn't seen my mother since the cafe. But I had learned something that made the silence easier. Some relationships don't end in fights. They just end. Quietly. Gradually. Without closure. Without anger. Like a door you decide not to knock on anymore, even though you still know the way. I did hear from Natalie again, the analyst who had once quoted me in that leadership spotlight. She was being promoted and asked if I'd be willing to speak to a group of junior hires at her office. I said yes. And when I stood in front of those fresh faces weeks later, I didn't give them a lecture. I told them a story. Not about pain, but about power. The kind that comes when you realize you were never hard to love. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to be less so they could feel more. They clapped, but even if they hadn't, I would have been fine. Because that's what healing looks like when it's real. It's not loud, it's not viral. It's a quiet morning when you make your coffee and realize you haven't thought about them in days. It's the moment you get good news and no longer wish they were the first to hear it. It's peace that doesn't depend on someone else's growth. It's building a life where you're no longer a footnote in your own story, sometimes. I still remember the moment in that kitchen, when my mother handed my brother a set of flight tickets and told me, "You're only here because I felt sorry for you." And I wonder what would she say if she saw me now. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, just out of honest curiosity. But then again, maybe the real question is, what would you do if the people who once made you feel invisible suddenly had to watch you shine quietly, unapologetically, and without needing them to notice?